Well, good morning and welcome to worship on this gorgeous Sunday morning. Yeah, I don't know if you can hear it over Zoom. There's folks joining us. Maybe you can see them on the screen, some of them anyway. But John's ringing the bell. We don't have the folks from College and Theater here with us today. They have an all-day event going on at the theater, which is great news for them. But it means we're back in the Stone Age for us. We've got cell phones up around the sanctuary. We can hear little echoes here and there, and we have new things, or old things that we're trying out, and we have some folks just arriving. All right, Josh, Caleb, Elizabeth, good to see you, and good to see you all here. There's folks in the sanctuary with us and people at home, and it's just a great day to be here. My name's Keith Simmons, and I am one of many people in ministry here at Duncan United Church, along with all of you. I hope you can hear me okay back there. We had to turn the mics off because they didn't work with Zoom. So in order for people to hear us at home, we just have to elevate our voices here. So I hope that's working. And just welcome everybody to worship today. And I just wanted to say it's Indigenous Sunday across the country, and that's particularly poignant this year, I think, with what folks have found in Kamloops and what we know is waiting in other places where those residential schools were present. And so we're thinking a lot more about, history on the land and how we got here and the stories we told when we got here, and maybe another way to tell those stories and a way to hear the stories of the people who were here so that we can witness and be one in this. And to that end, at the beginning of the service, I was handing out some friendship bracelets. They kind of look like this. Joan Mueller made them, and Joan was very involved in NAG, the National Aboriginal Games, or Aboriginal Institute, National Indigenous Games, I think it was called. Oh, that's where NAG came from, North American Indigenous Games. You can tell I wasn't here when they happened, but Joan Mueller certainly was, and she was one of the people who volunteered, along with many, many other people from Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities here in the Cowichan. In order to host those games, everybody had to be involved. And there was a lot of cultural training so people could understand that these folks were coming from all across North America, what their traditions were. Joan joined a drumming group that was made up of people who were Indigenous and non-Indigenous. She still belongs to that group. And one of the things that she thought that she could do when we're talking about being a church that's grounded also in Indigenous tradition, that's why we changed the colors of our crest to have the colors of the four directions on them. to remember that as long as at least Methodists were here, I'm not sure about the Presbyterians, but Methodists and Congregationalists, there were congregations who were Indigenous congregations who were Methodists. The first ones were Mohawk. And that's why we have a Mohawk on our crest that says all our relations, to mirror the Latin language that from John's gospel that says that all might be one. So a recognition that in both cultures and traditions, there's a sense that we're all one in God. And so we have these friendship bracelets that Joan made for us that are in the colors of the four directions. And I thought it'd be good to have them today to have some sense that we are all one in God, that we're united in a circle of friendship and fellowship and common humanity in the light of our Creator. So those are there, and there will be lots in the church. If you're out there in Zoom land and you'd like one, you're welcome to receive one. It looks like I'm frozen in Zoom land, but I'm not sure. I look like I'm in mid-voice. So hopefully people out there can hear me, and it's all good, Jeff says. It's just me looking like I'm frozen. So there you go. So let's think about who we are and whose we are as we continue on in worship on this day. And as we enter into worship, let's figure out the technology, which is always interesting and often surprising. It's kind of like, well, there's an old saying that if you really want to make God laugh, all you have to do is tell her your plans, because she'll roar for half an hour, thinking that you actually thought you were going to do that. It's interesting that you thought you were going to do that, God would say. But one of our plans is to remind ourselves of who we are and whose we are, that Duncan United is an affirming church, that we commit to walk in the way with Christ. We strive to embrace diversity, and we affirm that every part of creation is beloved and worthy. And that extending unstinting hospitality without condition, unconditional love to all is just, it's a lived expression of Christ's message of unconditional love. We also acknowledge that for thousands of years, long before Europeans got here, Indigenous people lived among and cared for the relations of this sacred coastal land, wherein we too live and we love and we worship. So we therefore gratefully acknowledge the people of the Cowichan, the Warm Land, members of Cowichan tribes on whose unceded territory we stand, and let us together uphold their traditions, the gospel traditions of love, generosity, kindness, and respect. So let us consider that, who we are and whose we are and how we are on this path together. As Connie plays our opening music, Spirit God, be our breath.
Spirit God, be our breath, be our song, blow through us, bring strength to all. Our world seems inward, defensive, withdrawn. Spirit God, be our song.
Let us join together in our opening prayer, saying, loving one, we live in the land and territories of careful stewards and wisdom givers. Hills, meadows, waters, and forests cry out among us in ways we have not recognized, in language we cannot speak. How shall we learn to communicate so that we might care and tend and steward alongside those who were here before us? Amen. As here in these words of assurance, we know that Christ calls us into community, into relationship, into reconciliation and renewal. We have but to listen to learn, but to practice to succeed. Let us hold that thought as we consider we're all thirsty for God's love. Connie plays and sings, and perhaps folks sing at home, and maybe we can speak the words here. Oh, yes. And Jeff says I should probably light the Christ candle too, because Bill's waiting to do that at home. And so we remember that once there came among us someone who did many wonderful things, a person of deep wisdom and incredible love, from whom God seemed to just radiate. He was one of those people that you knew just loved you just for who you were, kind of I don't know, like maybe the best grandparent there ever was or something. Anyway, wherever he went, he told people incredible things like great truths. And they would ask him often, so who are you that you know all of this? Who are you? They had all kinds of things that they said he was. But one of the times they asked him, he said, well, you know who I am. You already know that. He said, I am the light. But do you know what? So are you. Jesus Christ, the light of love among us, now and forever. Now we'll hear our opening hymn.
All who are thirsty, all who are weak, come to the fountain, dip your heart in the stream of life, let the pain and the sorrow be washed away in the waves of God's mercy. As deep cries out to deep, we sing, come, Lord Jesus, come. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Lord Jesus,
Well, good morning, everybody. So I'm wondering if anybody has any siblings or brothers or sisters.
Oh, yeah.
Yes? Yeah. Well, has it ever been hard to have a brother or sister or be a sibling? Elizabeth says yes. Is it hard sometimes having family or friends that are similar age to you? Or is it a good thing? It's a good thing. Yeah. Well, a long time ago, there were two brothers. The firstborn was Esau, and the second was Jacob. The oldest son, Esau, was a strong athlete. He was an outdoorsman and really good at hunting. At that time, hunting was as popular as ice hockey or basketball is today. Their father, Isaac, liked Esau because he enjoyed watching Esau playing games. Well, on the other hand, the youngest son, Jacob, was smart and clever. He was so good at math that he could win almost every card game. He preferred staying indoors and managing lots of things like housekeeping, such as cooking and cleaning. Their mother, Rebecca, liked Jacob because she enjoyed being with Jacob and having him assist with her chores. Well, the thing is, Isaac had the authority to bless the firstborn, Jacob, the youngest. Wasn't happy about it. Why will Esau, who is not as smart as me, get all the blessings from my father? Jacob really wanted to get blessings. What's so important about blessings? Because a blessing from Isaac is like a blessing from God. When their father Isaac became old and nearly blind, he called Esau and wanted to bless him. Before the blessing, Isaac asked Esau, "You go outside and hunt for me, and then fix me a hearty meal." So Esau went out to hunt. Rebecca overheard the conversation. She called to Jacob, "I'll prepare a hearty meal. You disguise yourself as Esau and get the blessing from your father." Because Esau was a hairy man and Jacob had smooth skin, Jacob wore Esau's clothes and disguised himself with goat skins, like Esau. Jacob went to his father pretending that he was Esau. Isaac doubted a little bit at first and asked, "Are you really Esau?" Jacob said, "Yes, father." Isaac said, "Come close, son." When Isaac kissed Jacob and smelled the smell of Esau's clothes, he finally blessed Jacob with all the beautiful words. After Jacob got the blessing, Esau came home and realized that Jacob had stolen his blessing. Esau was so angry and said, "Jacob deceived me and my father. He stole my blessing. I will kill him." As I told you, Esau was a strong fighter, and he really meant it. Although Jacob got the blessed words from Isaac, he couldn't gain anything and had to escape from Esau. But Jacob didn't know that stealing the blessing of his own brother is far from receiving blessings. Jacob had to go through the unspeakable hardships for many years in order to realize this. And to be prepared to get a real blessing, later Jacob had to ask forgiveness of Esau. After reconciliation, it's a big word, Jacob became the person who could get God's blessings properly and share them with others properly. So we need to remember that having good relationships with our brothers and sisters is really important and critical to get blessings from God. And that's why today is Indigenous Sunday and we wear the colors. We have our orange shirts, recognizing that we have a lot of work of reconciliation to work with our brothers and sisters. So we work and we will get there. Amen.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a perfect story for reconciliation. We know it was a long road for the two of them, but eventually they worked it out. So now we're going to hear from the scriptures of our people from the first letter of Peter at chapter 2, verses 9 to 17. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably amongst the Gentiles, so that though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right, you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Teaching from Peter's letter. Now we're going to hear from Mark's Gospel at chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. So let's hear what Mark has to say. It's about Jesus and a storm. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let's go across to the other side." And leaving the crowds behind them, they took him in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with them. A great windstorm arose and the waves beat into the boat, so the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushions. And they woke him up and they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And then the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. And he said to them, "So why are you so afraid? Have you no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Reading from Mark's Gospel, hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. So in this Gospel reading, I first wanted to talk a little bit about that first reading, because it wasn't one that I picked. I would say that's the church triumphant, or the church saying, be very, very quiet. It comes from a time when people were being persecuted for being Christians, when they were told that they would be hunted down and they could be killed for being Christians. That just by the very act of saying that they love Jesus and they love God, things could get very bad for them. And so this is a letter written a few generations, like probably maybe 100, 150 years after Jesus, by somebody in the church saying to the people that believe and follow Jesus, let's just keep a very low profile. Let's give to the emperor what he wants, and let's just try and let's just not rock the boat. We could be swamped. Let's just be very careful. And that's what Peter's letter is saying in this place to people. Let's be very careful. So this reading has also been taken by people in the church and upheld to say it's the church's job to support the empire. It's the church's job to do what the government says we should do. And it's also the church's job maybe to change the government into something that we, the church, think we should have. The church should follow along and do what the powers and the principalities want us to do. And lots of people have said that over the last couple of thousand years, particularly after the Emperor Constantine said that Christianity was going to be his official religion. And they should figure out how to support him because he was going to support them. And for 1700 years, we've been doing some of that, some supporting of the empires. And so this piece was written or chosen by Stan McKay. Stan McKay is a man who used to lead our church. But Stan McKay was a little bit different kind of a minister than many other ministers. Stan McKay comes from a place called Fisher River First Nation. Stan McKay is a Cree man. Stan McKay is growing up in Christianity and in Indigenous traditions. And so when Stan McKay picked this piece of scripture, he wrote this sermon starter, he called, and he sent that out to different ministers in the church, well, to all of us, and said, I wouldn't mind if you started off your sermon on Indigenous Sunday with these. So here's words from Stan McKay about 1 Peter 2, 9-17. Here's what he has to say. The first I heard of the Indigenous Day of Prayer was in the 1970s when Reverend John Thompson was the minister in Saddle Lake, Goodfish Lake, Alberta. The United Churches collaborated with the traditional teachers in developing a ceremony of fasting and prayer by a sacred fire. It would begin at noon on June 20th and end at noon on June 21st with a feast. It was a spiritual renewing of the covenant between the Creator, the people, and creation. The 21st of June has become National Indigenous Peoples Day to the Canadian public without awareness that it is rooted in the spiritual teachings of the land. The reading from 1 Peter begins by expressing the belief that the children of Israel are a chosen people, chosen by God, and are a holy nation. In the missionary work of the church, there had been an assumption that Indigenous people could be amongst the chosen if we gave up. If we gave up our identity, we gave up our language, if we gave up our culture. This belief is acted on in the development of residential schools and day schools. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Verses 13-17 is a section I have labeled as the Indian Act Directive. It's understandable that the early church is under attack and live in fear of harm from the authorities. The compromise is they must do what the authorities command. If they're going to survive, they have to listen. There is a challenging suggestion that we live as free people, but we honor the emperor. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right, you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. Restrictive legislation has had a negative impact. I had a message from an elder who works as a spiritual counselor and a ceremonial leader in a jail in Manitoba. There are almost 500 men in the jail, and she said 85% are Indigenous. The same percentage applies to the 11,000 children in Manitoba who are in provincial custody. The intergenerational impact of residents is the desire to walk together. As Indigenous people, we seek to assure our children that we are amongst the chosen people. We are of holy nations. In the struggle to maintain health and purpose during this global pandemic, we continue to act and pray with respect and love. And as there is an environmental crisis and a concern about the loss of diverse life forms on our planet, we must reclaim our identity and our values as Indigenous peoples and encourage our relatives, all people, to share the responsibility of caring for creation so that those yet unborn may live. On the prairies, we say we are all treaty people. We all live under the banner of a covenant relationship that was expressed in the teachings of our elders many years ago. The central teaching of respect is expressed in 1 Peter 2:17. Honor everyone, all my relations. Words from Stan McKay, one of our moderators, still a good leader. There's a picture coming up, if we're sharing the screen now. Jeff.
Turn your camera towards you a little bit more. All we see is your ear.
What, this one?
There we go.
It's funny, eh, when I look at it. Oh, well. So the reflection, I said apology. There is no word for apology. That's what I called this. And that's because Stan McKay told us that. He was one of our teachers at the Center for Christian Studies. This is Stan in the foreground of this picture. The man in the vest. He comes to teach us. He also teaches at the Jesse Soto School for Indigenous people who are becoming ministers, also diaconal ministers, but in the Indigenous traditions. Sandy Soto School is just a little bit north of Winnipeg and Beausejour, and we would go there for courses sometimes too. And so Stan, in this occasion, is being honored by the Center for Christian Studies. He's being made a companion of the center, upheld as one of the great teachers of ministry at the center. So there he is, and that's a little, a sense of just, I don't know if you can get the kindness and the warmth that radiates from Stan, but it is there. And the next image is an image of what Stan was talking about, I think Christian triumphalism, what happens when Christians follow the powers and the principalities and say that we're going to do what needs to be done, what the governments call us into, what the powerful people call us into. This is just one of many crusades where Christians left Europe and went over to the Middle East and decided to convert people, Jewish people, Muslim people, whoever they found, using the sword. And it's kind of like, we'll do it by force, and we will bring people in by force. And we think of the culture and the times that people lived in those days, it was a culture and time where the people who had the biggest armies could tell all the other people what to do. And the church was kind of organized on a similar way. They had powerful people on top telling the people on the bottom what to do and whether or not they were in right relationship with God, which isn't exactly what Jesus came to say. I think Jesus came to say we're all in right relationship with God all the time. But as we grew this church structure, it felt like it had to tell people what to do to be in right relationship all the time, that it needed to intervene. And it intervened with swords sometimes. The next picture is a picture of what's called social Darwinism in practice. So around in the 1800s, there was a fellow named Charles Darwin who came up with the theory of evolution. And it sort of boiled down to, well, the strongest evolutionary traits survive and all the other ones drop off. And people kind of embraced that. They could see the logic in that. And they said, well, that must be the way it is in life too. Like the strongest people rise to the top. They're the ones that get everything. And the other ones, well, they'll drop off. Or they'll get a chance to be strong themselves. And that's the way the world should work. It was called social Darwinism, and lots of people believed in that. And believing in that, they could do things like this. And anybody ever read Charles Dickens? Do you know about, okay, so do you know a story about a boy called Oliver Twist? Remember that story? So this next picture comes from that story. And what do you think he's doing, Oliver Twist, in this picture? You remember the story? Yeah. He's a very hungry boy, and he says, please, sir, can I have some more? And the fella who has the soup is not very happy with that. How dare this boy ask for more? How dare he ask for enough? How dare he even say he's hungry? He's getting everything he should be getting and then some. See, in those days, they thought that if children weren't working on the farm, there were lots of other jobs for them. And so they called these places not orphanages, really, they called them workhouses. They would put the kids to work. If you were 7 years and up, you went to work. If you didn't go to work, well, it was too bad for you. This next image is a picture of some kids working in factories in Canada, textile factories. These kids are probably about 7 years old. And they were working in a factory. There were they're climbing and standing on the equipment and trying to make the shuttles work and make everything work. They're small enough to get up there without breaking the equipment. And so they were valued and liked in the factories, but they also got hurt a lot in those factories. Yeah, the pulleys and belts. Yeah, they get caught in those. You're right, John. So the next picture, this one is from Fernie. It's from 1911. And in the front, you can see the boys. They've always had boys go down into the coal mines. And the reason they had boys go in the coal mines is because boys could get into places that men couldn't. Boys were good at leading the horses and the ponies that were down there. Boys were really good for sorting coal. Boys could do a lot of jobs down there that they didn't need a man for, and boys worked for a lot less pay. Boys started going underground when they were 9, 10, 11 years old. Now, that caused a big controversy in the world. And a lot of people, a lot of Christians said, you know what, this is just not what we think should be happening. We think that we should be treating children differently. Jesus said, let the children come unto me. And so there was a big storm. And the next image probably comes from Mark's gospel. There's a big storm. This is Rembrandt saying that's what that storm probably looked like. No wonder those people were so afraid in that boat. Look at what's happening to them. They're about to get overwhelmed. And it was like in our culture at the time, there was a big storm going on. There were the people who said children got to work and you know, the best people rise to the top and get everything, and the rest of them, well, they get a chance to be the best. And if they're not the best, well, that's just what Darwin said would happen. So there's a big debate in society and in culture in those days. People were very angry and got very upset. There was a big storm happening. And some people thought, and had thought for hundreds of years, that, well, the storm is one of the things that happens to us. And so we have the next image of a man, very, very long time ago, a man named John of the Cross. John of the Cross said, wait a minute, it shouldn't be all about a big storm. We're all about love and care, and we love each other and we care for each other. And the rest of the people, John of the Cross was a monk in a holy order in those days. The rest of the people in his order locked him up, and they said, you shouldn't be talking like that to people. They're going to get the wrong idea. They have to come to God through us. And John of the Cross said, no, God's already there. And they did some horrible things to John of the Cross, but eventually they saw that he had the light inside of him, and they changed the way they did things and tried to change the way the world was. The next image is an image of another person who saw the world in quite a different way. Her name was Julian of Norwich. She's a gifted writer. People listen to her words now as they did when she was writing them, but she was bricked up in a very small room. Now, they said she chose that for herself, that she would stay in this very small room and hand out her words through the same hole that her food was handed in. But some people think it's because she was a woman having a mystic experience with God in a time when only men were supposed to do that she had to stay in that very small room, because if she went out of it and talked about God's love for the world in the ways that she did, she might have been seen as a threat. And women who were seen as a threat in those days, good things didn't happen to them. On the contrary, the church had a place for women who were seen as, you know, in relationship with God. They called them witches, and they did things to them that were not good things. We've had this struggle in the church and in our society for a very long time. People who say things need to happen in this way, and people who say God is present with us and we need to be all about love in the world. This struggle's gone on in the world, I think, as long as there have been people. The next image is somebody's idea of a man who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Anybody ever hear of? Oh, yeah, a few people read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. All right. And the Chronicles of Narnia, people read that. And okay, so who's God in those stories? Do you remember who's supposed to be God or Jesus in those stories? He's got long yellow hair, got great big teeth, and when he talks, it's like a roar. You know who that is? His name's Aslan, is it? Right, the lion. And C.S. Lewis, who wrote those stories, when he was a young boy, was sent to a boarding school in England where very, very difficult things happened to him. And it said that for most of the young boys who were sent to boarding schools in England, really hard things happened to them in those schools. They weren't treated very well at all. And it was just thought that that's the way it needs to be. You got to toughen them up. And they'll make the connections in those schools that will do well for them the rest of their lives. And they go in there to be toughened up. He wasn't treated very well at all in those schools. In fact, for a while, he just said, I can't believe there is a God. Because if there's a God, things like this wouldn't be happening to children. And he walked away for quite a while. And then he started to think about God's love and how he experienced that. And he came back in and he wrote Narnia, and he wrote lots of other books that adults could read in a different way about relationship and God and how God's there for us, and how it's people trying to pull us back, but God who's always urging us in. The next image comes from somebody who argued very strongly that God was always present for all of us. His name is Walter Rauschenbach, and he's the one who wrote down the idea of something called the social gospel. And what Walter said was, I don't think the church should be supporting kids working in factories. I don't think the church should be supporting people working until they're exhausted and they die. I think Jesus calls us into love, and this isn't love. We need to do something different. And Walter called on churches to get with the program and to help change the world and shift things around and make them differently. Some of the people that followed Walter and understood what he said were in this next group. Which is a picture from a place. Anybody hear of a place called Winnipeg? Yeah. All right, okay. And this is Winnipeg in 1919. Does anybody know what happened to Winnipeg? Okay, Lisa? The general strike, yeah. It's called the Winnipeg 1919 general strike. It was actually across Canada. And yeah, there were people killed on a particular day in Winnipeg. And they were trying to get the 8-hour day, reasonable pay for work. Stuff that, some of these signs, we fight for full and free unemployment insurance. Holy cow. We're all one for all and all for one. And who gave the mayor the permission to call a militia out and shoot at people? So one of the people that was involved in the leadership, who was hunted down by the police and arrested for sedition and treason and trying to bring the government down, was this next fella. He's a Methodist minister. His name is J.S. Woodsworth. J.S. Woodsworth tried to get the church to change, but a lot of the churches didn't want to change. A lot of the people who went to church owned the factories, and they didn't think the church needed to change. And J.S. Woodsworth eventually stopped being a minister and ran for the House of Parliament and helped found a party called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, and became one of the most respected political leaders in Canada. He's a deeply devout human who believed that God loves all of us. And when it came time for Canada to declare war in 1939, J.S. Woodsworth stood up and spoke about the inhumanity of people killing people, and that it could all be resolved if we had just reached out to one another in love. And his words were taken with respect. People understood that they came from his heart and from his relationship with God. His next image, though, is where the church thought that it needed to do the right thing, both for the church and for the government. It's done by a Manitoba artist, and it's his impression of the RCMP coming to take the children away and take them to residential schools. It's where the church said the government is doing the right thing, and we need to be part of it. The next image is a clearer sense of a mom trying to get her baby back. And it's through our artists, I think, that sometimes we understand more deeply what happens in our history. Our artists somehow portray things more clearly. And so the next image is of a school just to the north of us. Everybody hear of a place called Port Alberni? All right, okay, people know Port Alberni. Well, this school burned down 3 times. I can only imagine why. It was a residential school in Port Alberni. It was run first by the Presbyterians, but when the United Church of Canada became the United Church in 1925, it was run by the United Church. And in that school, the next image are a bunch of kids, like in 1960. This is the class from grade 1 to grade 7. And the next image are the class from grade 1 to 6, and this is 7 to 12. These are the kids who in 1960 were in that school. There were hundreds and hundreds of kids in that school. And the idea was to change them. As Stan McKay said in his letter, to make them something that they weren't, to make them forget their history and their relationships and who they were and who their parents were, what their language was. Kids came here from all over. There were kids from the couch and in this school for sure. And so the church really tried to change people and make them like what we thought, make them obey the rules. We thought God didn't love them unless unless they were us. And there's been a lot of hurt and a lot of pain and a lot of sorrow out of that. A lot of depression, a lot of suffering. And for some people in the church in the 1960s, the next image says, well, we kind of thought that's the way it was supposed to be. This is from a book by a woman named Karen Armstrong, who's written incredibly great books about God and love and how we're blessed in God. But she was a nun for a while in England. And in her order, the group of people that she was in relationship with, they decided that you had to have a lot of pain to really know God. You had to have lots of pain and suffering. And that's how you knew God. So she wrote a book called The Spiral Staircase that talked about how depressed she was and how she lost her relationship with God. And then she left the church and she went to the Holy Land, and she found that God was still there, but in a much different way than the church had said God was. But her teachings and the teachings right up to the 1960s and probably beyond were God wants us to go through pain. Or Jesus might have said that if we experience pain, God is there with us. It's not that we have to go through pain to find God. It's just that we all go through pain, and God is there with us. The next image is something that the government of Israel does when they're fighting children and the children die. They take their bodies and they hide them and they don't give them back. There's a new story now of after 3 years, they gave the boy's body back to his family. He's 15 years old. They do that in part to punish the family, but in part just to say who's in charge and who's in control. And we know that that's happened throughout the history of residential schools here. When children died, they were not given back to their families. They were just hidden away, and not their families never had the chance to say goodbye to them. Yeah, really. Yeah, there were 215 just found in Kamloops, and there are more, and we think in every school. So one of the things that we've been asked to do as a church is to help find them. And we're going to do that in Alberni right away. And every school where people ask us to, we'll do it. But there has to be thoughtfulness about it, because even the act of putting radar waves into the ground is in a way disturbing those bodies. And so you have to do it with a ceremony and a ritual and a sense of what's happening. So the community in Port Alberni, they have a sense of what they need to do there, Indigenous folks there, and they've asked us. The other 4 residential schools that United Church ran in BC were at different levels of conversation with, but when we get asked, we'll go. We've made all our records available, but sometimes we didn't know as a church, things weren't recorded. So we will go and help find. The next image is my sense of just wondering about church. Now, this is kind of a funny one. You can't really see it, but this minister somewhere in the States has decided that he would take great big pictures of everybody in his congregation and stick them on the pews. So at least when he was preaching virtually, he'd know somebody was out there. So he put them all on the pews. We have this sense of, but maybe is this a sense of the church inside? Is this church by itself? What's church about? We've seen the church has a huge effect on the world, but sometimes we think, well, it's all just us. And if we can't be in here, at least we can put our pictures up so we know what church is. I thought it was kind of funny. We do have an effect on the world, though, and we have changed the world in ways that we need to pay attention to and focus on. We can't just focus on what's happening inside. We have to take a look at what's happened on the outside. And there are things around us that we're aware of and we're trying to help out with. One of the things in the Cowichan is the next image, an image of missing men. There are so many men missing from this part of the world that go unremarked. Indigenous men. And I think of a time a couple of years ago when a non-Indigenous man disappeared, and we moved heaven and earth for weeks and months until that person was found, so we could bring some peace to his family. And yet when Indigenous men disappear, we don't do that at all. And I wonder what that says. What else is going on in our culture that's happening? When somebody's Indigenous disappears, it's almost like we think, well, that's what happens in that community. When somebody who's not Indigenous disappears, we ignore all signs that point towards a possible outcome and continue seeking, which we should, I think. I wonder what it says about us. Are we still caught in some way in that old way of the church seeing the world as different for one group of people than another group of people? Maybe that's a message we could think about. The next image talks about that as well. It talks about child poverty in the Cowichan and compares it to the rest of BC. And we are in almost every way ahead in the Cowichan Valley. There are more kids in poverty here than the rest of the province. And we think about that. We also think that we have the largest Indigenous population on site in the province, and most of that child poverty, not all of it, but most of it is in Indigenous communities. And so what does that say? I mean, we tell this story about getting here to this land and being welcomed on this land and saying that we would always look after the people who were here because we're using the resources that were theirs when we got here. And what have we really done? Our government right now is fighting court cases against Indigenous children to say that we shouldn't have to provide the same level of support as we do for non-Indigenous children. The federal government's doing that. So what's really happening here? Have we started to heal and reconcile, or have we not? You know, we have to look at facts. The next image is of a church that actually got involved and decided that it would at least help the community have a conversation and be open for the discussion. And I know some members of that church went to this meeting. Oh, wait a minute. Does anybody recognize that hall? Do you know where that is? It's, oh, I wonder where that, you know what? That's Duncan United Church's hall. And that's our MLA, Sonia Furstenau, calling together a community meeting to talk about the high rate of children in care who are from Indigenous communities. And she's saying, wait a minute, shouldn't we be supporting everybody in every way we can? So she called a meeting to talk about that, and it happened here in this place. Duncan United Church is often a place that's open to bring people in to hold space for conversations. And often there are members of our church who are there participating in those conversations. The next image is also from the Cowichan. You know, we have Red Dress Day pretty much across the country to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And in the Cowichan, they talked about Indigenous women and men. So on that image, you see a shirt, that's for the men, and a red dress for the women. And there were different ceremonies. And there were people from Duncan United Church who were part of that. Jeff was part of helping organize some of those ceremonies. And at our church, we, along with most other places in Duncan, put red dresses in the window to say we acknowledge that there's still something happening in our culture that says that women could go missing at this huge rate. And it's not like a huge uproar in our community. Every time a woman disappears, it should be a huge uproar. And we want to hold this up and say, what's happening in our culture, in our community, that we are not paying attention? As a church, we have learned some things, and we want the rest of the culture to learn some of those things too. The next image is another one of the red dresses that was in our window. The next one is our church logo. It says seeking justice, loving kindness, walking humbly with our God, and has the image of the rainbow on the top, which is a seen in our society and our culture is a symbol of inclusivity and welcome. And the hand and the cross holding people from different ethnic backgrounds within it, saying that we are all one in this together. We see in Christ's light, in God's promise, unity, that we're all one. That was designed by one of the kids who grew up in this church, who came up through Sunday school and young people's, is now a young mom herself, and designed that image. We had a contest, I guess it was. We asked people to submit designs. I won't say this is the only one submitted, but it was one of very few. And I think she submitted all of them. So it was a great gift from Sarah Bercier to bring this to us. And it's a sense of who we are and who we want to be in our community. The next image is something we're going to see more of in our church, the symbol of Affirm United, which is what we're trying to say is a way that we recognize that there have been other people that we have shut out from the church in the past, and we said that weren't good enough. We said they were sinful and broken people. And we recognize that when we've done that, we kind of have to go a little bit of an extra mile to say, no, really? Like, we don't know what we were thinking then, but we lived in a different time, in a different culture, in a place where, well, they used to use kids as labor. And that's not us anymore. Really, believe me, that's not us. The problem for us in this culture right now is that it still is some parts of Christianity. There are churches in other parts of the world that say that if you're part of the spectrum, LGBTQ2S, that you're a bad person, you should at least go to jail. And so we have to find ways to let people know that we are not a church that says that. We are a church that says, you're welcome. You're so welcome. Please come and have a cup of coffee and let's talk about things. There's been a lot of trauma and a lot of hard time in the world, and we want people to know that they're welcome and in their language, right? I mean, we have our language, but it should be also in the language of the people who are coming. Like when we went to the airport, you remember the Syrian family, you guys, that used to come here when you guys were here? Well, when we met them at the airport, we had a big sign that said, welcome. What do you think it would have looked like if it was in English? You think they would have been able to read it? No, we had to find somebody who knew how to print in Arabic, which is, for me, like it's a very different language. It goes from left to right and it looks like musical notes. It's beautiful language. We had to get somebody to do that. And we held it up and we hoped that it actually said welcome and not something else. But unfortunately, it looked like it said welcome and they knew that they were welcome because it was in their language. And so we think of how do people know they're welcome? What language do they speak? And how would Indigenous people know that they're welcome in this place? And so sometimes we put on dinner and we say, come on down, have dinner. And boy, we see a lot of people coming then. There are lots of different ways that we welcome people. The next image is somebody who's always been welcome here. His name is Ron George. His name's Tusilam, and he's been here. Sometimes he's led children times for us. He just turned up one Sunday, I remember, started a drum, taught the kids a song. It was amazing. Then he stuck around after church and we said, Tusilam, we're trying to figure out how, like, it seems like in our community, lots of times if you're First Nations or Indigenous, you're over here. And if you're European background, you're over there. How do we get together more? And we're trying to figure out how to make that change. And he said, well, I've got this idea. He said, why don't we run something called Cowichan 101? And we'll all just get together. And he said, we'll teach you people stuff about this territory because we've lived here for 10,000 years. There's lots of things we know that you don't know. We'll teach you. He said, we won't teach you everything because you already took a lot and we've lost a lot, but we will teach you. And so the next image are a couple of people teaching us sort of a Cowichan 101. And they've been in this church too. Ron George's brother, Robert George, is in that picture, and so is somebody else sitting down in the front at the center. And let's see, he's been here. He's, I think, led worship here on Indigenous Sunday at least once, if not twice. Yeah, Fred Rowland. And those people are all people who are in the teaching course at BIU. They're teaching some Cowichan 101 to out in the woods where, probably at Fred's place, actually, it looks like. So something that's we participated in is also helping the community heal. We're learning from one another, and we tried to fund some of that, and we'll continue on funding it. But we still have to deal with the stories that are out there. We haven't yet, as a community and society, and as a church, dealt with where we're at. So the next image is from Stuart Patagon, who's on council with Cowichan Tribes. He's also an incredibly gifted artist. You can Google his name and find a website where his art is. It's amazing art. He developed this image after the news broke from Kamloops about finding those children. And it's a very compelling image. It's an image of children walking into a church where they should find life and love and finding instead waiting for them death and silence. It's an incredible image, very powerful. It's an image we need to see, I think, if we're going to uphold the next one, which is also one of Stuart's designs, that every child matters. I'm waiting for my t-shirt order. They're like sold out all the time. So I texted Stuart and asked him to let me know when the next ones are coming. So that if we're going to uphold this truth, that every child matters, then we have to be aware of what went on before. We have to witness to that. It's part of the Coast Salish tradition is witnessing and telling the stories. It's not for condemnation. It's not for demeaning, although sometimes I think, man, maybe it should be. It's for memory. So that when we hold these memories, we don't do it again, not that one. We're humans. We'll find something to do that's reprehensible, but not this again. Hopefully not this. The next image is something we did when the community started some voices, some very strong voices. I find there's always about 10 or 15% of the community has got a very strong voice. Usually engaging, as I used to do when I was in the trade union movement. Sometimes I get up to speak at a meeting and somebody would say, Simmons, like, how is it that you're always engaged in your mouth before your brain? Wait a minute. But then I started to realize as I got older, that was probably true. I get words coming out of my mouth long before I knew I was going to say them and be like kind of thinking maybe I should have engaged my brain first. So there were some people in our community when the pandemic was starting and there were people getting sick in Cowichan Tribes, many people were concerned and said, how can we help? When we bring groceries, what can we do to help out? I think most of the community did that. But about 15-20% of the community, maybe not even that much. It's a very loud voiced people who, like me, spoke without thinking, said, well, it happens over there because that's the way those people are. They're just like that. There are people who will get that because they're some lower form of person. And our church had something to do with people thinking that, right? We said, okay, well, we have to train them up to be Christians and teach them a different way. So our church also has some responsibility to say, no, that's not true. That was a teaching that we got from the empire, not a teaching we got from Jesus. The teaching we got from Jesus is we resist. We resist oppression. We stand together as one. And so Stuart Padawan actually had designed this image too. And so we thought, all right, but we need to contextualize this as a church. We need to not just have the justice hand, our fist up there. We also need to say, we are of one heart, one mind. We are working together as one people. Yeah, just like that, John. We are together working as one. So we put that image on our steeple. It was there for quite a while. And then some people said, no, we got to find another image that's more peaceful. Take that one down. So it had been up for a while. The next image is a church. I think this is in the Diocese of Montreal, big Anglican cathedral, trying to say, you know, we're still having these votes. The Anglicans are still having votes. And whatever the votes are, you are welcome here. And they're trying to proclaim in this cathedral by painting their steps a different color that even though this looks like a great big edifice and a place where like maybe you have to wear a brocade before you can come in here. Actually, this is a place where everybody's welcome. Come on in. It's kind of a startling thing to see on the steps of a cathedral, but they wanted people to know that this is a place where all of God's people are welcome in the language, in their own language. The next image are some people who speak a language that other people have a real hard time with, sometimes because it's heard differently. But Red Willow Women's Society is a small group of women who are trying to do something to support women who are losing their kids to apprehension. They're doing their best to raise the issue in our area. And sometimes they were able to meet here, and maybe someday they will again. The next image comes from, I think it's probably the Vancouver courthouse, but it's from many churches in many places. An image of children's empty shoes. We're trying to say that when we found a lot of kids' graves, for every grave, there's a pair of shoes. And let's think of those kids and let's remember them. The gift of this, I think, is that, you know, we've known this for a very long time in one level. If you read the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, when it came out, it already said, we're going to find these children. They're there. The elders said they were there. But we only knew it on one level. And finding the graves has gotten it to us on another level, on a heart level. It's opened us up differently. And that, I think that's the gift. The hope is that this time, maybe, it will make such a difference to us that we will start to see who we've been and start to shift and change our ways even more than we already have. We're no longer a country that sends 7-year-olds into factories or 10-year-olds into mines. And we don't have to be anymore a country that holds one people in some kind of different space, because their people were here when our people got here and we needed their land. There has to be a way to bring Jesus' message that God loves all children, regardless where they are, who they are, to the world. There has to be a way for us to do the next thing, to live into right relations. There has to be a way for us in this next, you know, as we see the next image, which comes out of a few churches around BC, living into right relations. We think about that story of Jesus and the storm, and we're all in the boat together. This next image kind of spoke to me of that. It's a church in Liverpool, or I think Newcastle, that was bombed in the war. And at the time this image was taken, people were using it to store their boats. Well, churches, many people told me, have been developed by people who come together knowing we're all in the same boat. Lots of churches were built by shipwrights, and the ones that weren't tried to give the impression that we were still in the same boat. We are all together in a boat. Jesus is with us in the boat. As we navigate the stormy waters of the world, we're all in that boat. And if you look up, you can see the ribs of the boat in this church, that they built this church to look like a boat upside down, but we're still contained within this boat and Christ is in it with us. I think the trick is not to think that the storms get actually that much calmer. It's us that can make the storms go calmer. It's us that can speak to one another, live in right relationship with one another. It's us that can recognize in the next image that we are all in this together, that we hold one another together. Oh, I think we skipped a couple. Wait a minute. There we go. That we're all in this together, that we actually have the power, even when we're in the midst of the great storms that threaten to overwhelm us and sink us, we can bring a calmness together. We can be in relationship with Christ. We can stop the fear and start the centering that we need to get through the storm. As any crew knows, if the ship's in trouble, the whole crew has to pull together. You ever been out in a lake in a storm in a canoe with a couple of other people? You know you all got to paddle like crazy in the same direction or you're not getting out of it. Well, Christ is with you and with all of us as we paddle together in the same direction. Some of us still need to proclaim. And this next image is of a man from Flin Flon, Manitoba, which is a place that I spent some years in, well, not comfort, I can tell you, but it's a place where I grew up and found out a lot about myself and about my relationship with powerful people. This man is a Catholic priest in Flin Flon. And his proclamation to his people, to his church, was amazing and powerful. If you have Google, you can look it up on Maclean's and look for Catholic priest Flin Flon. Maclean's magazine printed the whole text of his sermon, which went on at some length. But basically, he said that the church which thinks it has the moral authority, and he's talking in a Catholic context, but all churches, we're pretty sure we have moral authority. He said the church that thinks it has the moral authority to tell people they shouldn't use birth control, or that they shouldn't get together with members of the same gender, or that they shouldn't live their lives in a particular way. The church that thinks it has that moral authority, well, it has the residential schools hanging over it and has refused to apologize to the people that are asking for apologies. That church has no moral authority anymore. He said, what you need to do, you bishops, is take off your pointy hats and your brocaded robes and your big rings. What you need to do is strip yourself of all the vestments of power and sit down and shut up. Those are his words. And listen. Just listen. For once in your lives, just stop telling people what to do and how to live their lives and what they need to do to be right with you, and just listen. Just listen. Listen to what you've done. It's an important piece of tradition. In the next image, it's from a book, Bearing Witness to the Witness, and I think that's what we need to do. I remember when I was an advocate for unemployed people in the 80s, when we were all unemployed, it seemed like we all were. And I remember like guys would come into our office, mostly guys, by the hundreds, before they went down to the social welfare office or the unemployment office. And then they would come back in some despair. And I'd say, what was the despair about? And they said, well, I mean, they filled out the forms for me. That was good. And I gave them the answers you said to give them, because there were certain answers you had to give. But they wouldn't listen to my story. They didn't care that I worked for 30 years, my whole life, that I've run out of unemployment insurance and I have to go for welfare, and I feel so ashamed that I have to ask for this help. They wouldn't listen to me. They didn't care. And that was so hard, they said. And so we listened. We provided that witness. What's needed now in a lot of places, in Indigenous community and in the LGBTQ+ community, and places where people are marginalized and shut down and set aside, is just somebody to be the church and listen. Sometimes it's really hard. But you know, it's not directed at you. It's just, you could be the church for that person. You could be the one who listens, who witnesses, who says, I hear you. I hear you. I have no idea the pain you carry, but I hear you. And on behalf of those who walk this place before me, I just want to express my sorrow and my gratitude that you have done me the honor to share the story with me, that you have witnessed. Of course, there are many, many ways to witness. And as we end this very long, I'm sorry, journey. So that's another way to witness, is just to witness to the children, the energy and the joy of the children, to know that, thanks be to God, we are in a generational way of being in relationship, and that some things can be heard and witnessed to, and yet somehow left behind as we move together into a newer and different future. into a place of welcome and acceptance, a place where we hold one another in love, where we witness to God's love. Let us hope that on this Indigenous Sunday and every day, we find ways to be present to the stories that we hold them in ways that bring us into Christ's presence and acknowledge Christ's presence and God's presence in each one of us, so that our children and their children might move forward into a world that is more filled with faith and light and delight than an insistence that we follow the call of the empire and obey the laws of man. On this day and all days, may it be so. So let us think of that as we pray. Let us pray. Loving, creating God, we give you thanks. We give you thanks for our place in you and your place in each of us. We give thanks for this beautiful land that we are part of, for the welcome and the friendship extended to us by the people who are here when our people got here. We give you thanks for your love poured out and your constant promise of resurrection and renewal, that when we become reconciled to ourselves and to others, we are more fully open to your presence and your love in each of us. And so on this day and all days, we give thanks. We give thanks for our ability to reach out to one another, to offer hope to those who are suffering, to offer care to those who are in need, to offer whatever is needed to those who reach out, and to ourselves be present, to accept the offers of love that are extended to us. And so hear us then as we pray together, saying, Our Creator, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Let's move into an acknowledgement that offerings come in this church in many ways. And we have a plate, I think, at the door of the church on the way in if you wanted to offer in that way. And there are other ways that people are doing things at home. And there are also ways in which we extend our offerings of love to one another. Just, smiling at people is a great thing. Just being warm to people and bringing as much joy as you can in the world is a great way to offer God's love in the world. And we thank you for all the ways in which those things happen. And reaching out. And so I'll ask Connie to play our closing hymn, When Hands Reach Out.
When hands reach out beyond divides, and hope is truly found, each chain of hate will fall away, and bells of peace shall sound, and bells of peace
need answers. Let's light in the world and the creation that God has given us. Let's lift up burdens of doubt or loss. Let us lift away the self-talk of failure, and let us open up to one another as we are called to. Let us open up to one another as lights and delight in God as God delights in us on this day and all days. May that be so. Amen.